So after watching George's Jungle, I was browsing Disney Plus and I found this little guilty pleasure of mine. Adventures in Babysitting. So Adventures in Babysitting came out in 1987, was directed by Chris Columbus, and Chris Columbus made quite a name for himself from directing the first two Home Alones, and he's the kind of guy that you get when you want a John Hughes type movie, but you can't get John Hughes. And nowhere is that more obvious than in his big directorial debut, Adventures in Babysitting. And Adventures in Babysitting has the same spirit and overall feel as those classic 80s teen movies like Ferris Bueller, The Breakfast Club, or Pretty in Pink. It's got kind of that feel, except it's distributed by Touchstone Pictures, which is the Disney-owned production company when Disney wants to make a movie that isn't especially targeted towards kids. And even though this is a fun movie about kids going into the big city, getting in some trouble, it's not really a kids movie. This was rated PG-13 at a time when PG-13 was pretty new. Everybody likes to talk about how hardcore PG was before PG-13 was a thing, and yeah, that's true, but about halfway through the 80s, PG-13 came out, and when a movie was PG-13, they were able to get away with a bit more than PG-13 can get away with today. And weirdly enough, of all things, Adventures in Babysitting actually earns that PG-13 rating. There's nothing too objectionable in it, but yeah, there's a bit of a darker tone and some mature jokes and some language that little kids might not be ready for, but teenagers definitely can handle no problem. But what is the story of Adventures in Babysitting? Well, the story is actually pretty simple. You have our lead, Chris, played by Elizabeth Shue, and Elizabeth Shue does a great job in this movie. She's the babysitter, she's the main character, she's the one that we really get to focus on, and she does carry this movie. This movie proves that Elizabeth Shue can do a lot more than just be the love interest, because she was the love interest in the first Karate Kid, she was the love interest in Back to the Future Part 2 and 3, and for a lot of her filmography that's just kind of what she's done. But here, this movie lives or dies based on her performance, and I'm happy to say that she does a great job here. And the first time we see her, she's all excited, she's getting ready for a big date with her boyfriend Mike, played by Bradley Whitford. But when she opens the door, he's not there to take her out, he's actually there to cancel on her because he says that his sister has the flu and is contagious, so they gotta have a rain check on their date. And naturally she's upset about this, but now she's got a free Friday night, so of course she gets a call from the couple down the street. They got some kids and they need a sitter, so she's like, alright, it beats sitting here being depressed, I might as well make some money. So she goes off to babysit these two kids, and the kid that she's actually tasked with babysitting is named Sarah. She's maybe 8 years old, and she is obsessed with Thor. Yes, Thor, the Marvel comic character. This is decades before Disney bought the rights to Thor, but Thor is everywhere in this movie. You just look at her bedroom, it's just plastered wall to wall Thor. She's drawing pictures of Thor, she's got the Thor helmet and the hammer Mjolnir, and she's just a nerd, and it's kind of adorable, and she's like, Thor's my hero. You don't really see that kind of product placement, for lack of a better word, for one superhero in a movie that a character is just obsessed with. Usually in these types of movies you'll see them playing with like some Star Wars action figures or something, but her obsession with Thor is next level, and it's actually pretty fun. But she does have an older brother, Brad, who's about 15 years old, and he has a big old crush on Chris. So when Chris comes over, he's all awkward and nerdy, he's looking for some Clearasil to cover up his zit. Your typical 15-year-old boy shtick. But the night gets a little more complicated when we meet Brad's best friend Daryl, played by Anthony Rapp, and he's gonna spend the night too, so surprise Chris, you got two 15-year-old boys to worry about. And actually Anthony Rapp will go on to work with Chris Columbus much later in the Rent movie, and man, I really don't like that movie. It's one of those movies that I watch, I just feel like a crotchety old man yelling at a bunch of kids to get a job. But this video is not about Rent, it's about Adventures in Babysitting, and Daryl brings over this playboy, yes, a playboy in a Disney movie. And weirdly enough, the magazine actually stays relevant to the plot throughout the majority of the runtime, and that's because in the mother of all coincidences, the centerfold of that issue looks exactly like Chris. So every so often somebody will come up to Chris thinking she's Miss March and just start fawning all over her, even though she's like 17, and that's kind of weird. But the plot really gets going in pretty quick fashion. This is not a long movie. It's a breezy hour, 45 minutes. When Chris's best friend Brenda calls her from the train station, almost in tears, talking about how she ran away from home, she's got no money, she's trapped, and there's a bunch of homeless people talking to her, there's a guy with a gun, there's all these weird people, and she's scared, she doesn't know what to do. So instead of biting the bullet and having Brenda call her parents and face the consequences, Chris takes these children into the city to go get Brenda and bring her home. And it's around this point where this movie becomes what I like to call a what else could go wrong type of movie. It's one of those movies where anything that can go wrong does go wrong for our main characters, and it just keeps compounding on itself until we finally get the resolution and they just look beat and busted down, and they're just so happy to make it home and be alive. And even though, yeah, it's a bit of a cliche, I still enjoy this movie because even though you know at the end of the movie they're all going to make it home safe and they're all going to laugh about all the wacky adventures we went on, there are still legitimate stakes here because it does get dark, especially for what is ultimately a Disney family film. Yeah, it's Touchstone, it's not technically Disney, but it's Disney, it's on Disney Plus. But this movie isn't afraid to get into some dark and adult territory. And if it didn't have those darker moments, it wouldn't feel as satisfying when they have to race back home and make everything look neat and tidy before the parents realize they're out all day and getting into all kinds of trouble. And in this era of remakes, of course, Adventures in Babysitting got a direct-to-TV, I think, or maybe it was direct-to-streaming remake of Adventures in Babysitting a few years ago. It was pretty recent, and I just can't really get into that version, not because of nostalgia. I actually didn't see Adventures in Babysitting grow up. I was well into my upper teens by the time I even realized this movie existed, and when I saw it I'm like, oh, this is great. But it's because the remake doesn't have that danger. It doesn't earn that PG-13 that the original did. So yeah, I'd say pass on the remake. It just feels a little too squeaky clean for me. And in this movie, the misfortunes start happening when they're driving into the city. They're not even there yet and they're already having difficulty because they have a blowout. They get a flat tire and they don't have a spare. So they're kind of out of luck. But this creepy looking trucker with a hook for a hand named Handsome John Pruitt, he actually takes pity on these kids and offers to buy them a tire, take them to Dawson's garage, get the car fixed up so they can be on their way. And everything seems well and good, but about halfway there he gets a call on the radio saying that his wife is cheating on him, so they take a detour over to Pruitt's house and let's just say he catches them in the act. And while we don't exactly see everything, it's all shot from outside the house, so you only hear, noises and fighting and some choice words. Bullets do start flying pretty quick, and one of them hits the windshield of the car, so yeah, that's another complication. So the kids duck and cover inside this Cadillac that's parked in the street, but then that Cadillac gets carjacked by Joe Gipp, this car thief. He's probably about the same age as Chris. He looks like a pretty young guy, and he's jacking up this car, drives off, and he realizes, oh shoot, there's kids in this car, and this is not a great neighborhood. So we're just gonna take him to this chop shop and then, figure out a way to get the kids home after. But that's easier said than done because the owners of this shop, these criminal underworld types, they are like, these kids know where our operation is. They can go to the cops, so they lock them up upstairs. But while they're delivering, the kids escape, and Joe Gipp kind of looks on, and he's actually kind of impressed at the ingenuity of these suburban kids that probably never set foot in the city before. And I want to take a minute and talk about how underutilized Joe is in this movie. This guy is so charming and charismatic, and when he's on screen, you want to know more about his backstory and his life and his character. And he kind of gets sidelined a little too much because after this scene, he's just kind of lumped in with all the other villains. And while he is still sympathetic to the kids and even goes so far as to kind of sabotage the other guy's attempts to kidnap him, he still doesn't really spend time with our main characters. I would have kind of liked to see him join the group, and maybe he's the guy that Chris ends up with at the end of the movie instead of this random college kid, and we'll get to him in a minute. But first we gotta talk about the Playboy a little bit, because it's here where the Playboy becomes more than just a throwaway joke at Chris's expense. It actually becomes relevant to the plot, because the bad guys have their own copy that Daryl gets his hands on, because Brad in defiance threw the Playboy out the window when they were driving down. So in order for Daryl not to get in trouble for losing his dad's Playboy, he swipes one from the bad guys, but that magazine has important records for the bad guys that they need, and if the cops were to see those records, they would be put away for life, so they need to get that back so they can complete their operation. And now it's a chase movie where the kids are on the run in the city and we got these bad guys after them, and they wind up in a blues nightclub. This is probably one of the most famous, if not the most marketable scene in this movie, and it's when the kids wind up on stage at this club, and you got Albert Collins as this band leader who won't let anybody get off the stage without singing the blues. So we get a pretty cringe-tastic musical number out of it. And yeah, it's cringy because it's definitely this improvised blues thing where they just start talking and then you hear the da-na-na-na-na. And from that first riff, you could probably guess where this is going. And yeah, it goes there. And I remember the first time I saw this movie and I heard that, I was just kind of gripping my seat thinking, oh man, I hope this isn't as cringy as I think it's gonna be. And while it's not great and Elizabeth Shue is not the strongest singer, she really doesn't have to be for this scene to work, because everybody in this scenario, aside from the band, is supposed to be really uncomfortable and awkward, and sometimes the rhyme schemes don't always work the best, and that's kind of the charm of this scene. This is a very charming scene. It's cute, it's quaint. You just can't help but laugh at the awkwardness of it all. And really, Albert Collins' performance as this jazz musician, he saves this scene. He sells it, because there's such a steely determination in his eyes when he stares at you and he says, nobody leaves without singing the blues. And it just works. And yeah, the remake tried to recapture the magic of it, but again, it's just too clean and sanitized, and they turned this really awkward joke song into something that could probably be played on Radio Disney, and that's probably the intention of the remake. But there's such a certain charm about a really awkward blues set that was clearly made up on the spot. And after that little adventure, we get another iconic scene of the kids on the L train. They're actually moving forward. They're going somewhere, and they have some transportation for once. But while they're sitting there, two rival gangs come out of nowhere, and they're flanking them on each side. And they look like rejected concepts out of The Warriors. Everything in this movie is so exaggerated, it's kind of hilarious. But they're literally about to start killing each other right in front of these kids in some kind of train rumble. And Chris is like, hold up, just please wait to kill each other until we can get off the train. And they're none too pleased about that. So then Brad comes up and starts defending Chris, and that doesn't get him very far because he gets a switchblade in his foot. And it's here where we get not one, but two F-bombs in a PG-13 movie. And this might be the only case of that, because if you know, the MPAA in their divine wisdom somehow decided that one F-bomb is okay, but any more, not okay for PG-13. But this was the very, very early days of PG-13, and I don't think the rules were quite so set in stone. And it's here where I realized that with the version on Disney Plus right now, they censored the crap out of this movie. Because when Brad gets the knife in his foot, the gang leader says, "Don't fool with the lords of hell." To which Chris replies after yanking the knife out of Brad's foot, "Don't fool with the babysitter." And that causes both gangs to kind of back off a little bit, at least long enough for the kids to get off the train and take Brad to the hospital. And while I kind of get the reasoning for censoring it on Disney Plus, that has to be the most earned F-bomb ever in a PG-13 movie. A close second is probably Wolverine in X-Men First Class, but here it just kind of feels wrong to get rid of it, giving everything that Chris has been through up until this point, all the stress and craziness of this whole night, and now one of the kids that she's supposed to be responsible for has a knife in his foot, and she can't let off a little steam. I don't know, I just wish that now that Disney Plus has adult content on its platform, I mean, it's got Logan and Deadpool, I don't see why they can't restore it back to its original version, but only have it available to the adult accounts. But after a quick detour in the hospital where Brad only gets one stitch in his big toe, they wind up at a college frat party because Sarah has to tinkle. So they're like, all right, we'll stop in for a minute. She'll go to the bathroom. And it's here where she meets her other love interest in the movie, and it's Dan. He's this college kid. He thinks Chris is the most beautiful girl he's ever seen, and he gives her some money so that she can get her car back from Dawson's garage. So now they're going over there, everything's looking great, and we finally meet Dawson, and it's Vincent D'Onofrio in probably the most in shape I've ever seen him. And it's really incredible that he could be in such good shape in this movie, and in the same year he could be Private Pyle in Full Metal Jacket. I don't know what Stanley Kubrick did to him, but that's crazy. And Dawson takes their money, but they're $5 short. So he's like, all right, you're not getting a car. No chance. You either give me all $50 for the tire or no deal. And it's here where all the Thor references and jokes are paid off, because you look at Vincent D'Onofrio in this movie, and he looks like Thor. He's got the blonde hair, he's got the blue shirt, he's got the hammer. So of course Sarah's like, it's Thor, he's my hero, you're the greatest, you've been fighting the forces of darkness. And when she sees that he's not giving them the car back, he's like, how could you? You need your special helmet, that's why you're acting weird. So she takes off her helmet, gives it to Vincent D'Onofrio Thor. And that kind of melts his heart, and he's like, all right, what's $5? So he gives him the car back, and he actually gives her the helmet back, saying that he's got one more like it at home. And what I love about this scene is they do kind of leave it ambiguous as to whether or not this dude Dawson is Thor, which is kind of crazy, because from the adult lens you're like, okay, Dawson's clearly just this dude who owns a garage, and he just happens to look like Thor, and it's the kid's imagination that's connecting the dots. But the fact that he doesn't deny it, and he kind of lets her believe that he's him, and This is such a heightened world already. I mean, yeah, it's kind of gritty, but there is still an exaggerated 80s cheese, a kind of just magical feeling that you're like, well, maybe Thor does exist in this universe. It wouldn't be impossible to imagine. And from here, the whole adventure aspect kind of stops and the plot rears its ugly head. We get some closure with Mike. They stop at this restaurant and they see him there and realize that he was cheating on Chris, so he gets his comeuppance there. And then, of course, the bad guys roll up again. They were following them the whole time. They finally caught up with them. And now we have this big climax at this high-rise tower that just so happens to be hosting the party that these kids' parents are at. So now we have this extra layer of, oh, don't let the parents see them even though they're there, they're not supposed to be there. And we see Sarah dangling off of the outside of the building, these sheer glass walls, and we're like, yeah, that's child endangerment right there. I'm pretty sure if the parents saw that, Chris would never be hired to babysit anybody ever again. But all this gets resolved pretty easily with a bit of fun slapstick, because this isn't really a plot-based movie. If anything I've told you has sunken in, this is a road trip, adventure to adventure, meeting different people, getting into situations, getting out of them, and then getting back home safely and laughing about how many times they almost died. Oh, and I almost forgot, they do pick up Brenda from the train station. She's safe. I can't believe I almost forgot to mention the ending of the storyline that kicked off the movie in the first place. I guess that just shows you what kind of movie this is, and it is a lot of fun. Is this a cheesy movie? Definitely. Would I consider it a guilty pleasure? Yeah. Is it for everybody? No. This is a very specific time capsule of a type of movie that was made in the 80s, like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, like Pretty in Pink, where they weren't afraid to write teenage characters like real teenagers, have them swear a little bit, give them some innuendos, because that is most of what your teenage years are, but also wasn't afraid to get a little dark and dangerous with these kids. There are moments of legitimate danger here where you're like, I don't know how these kids are gonna make it out. And sadly, that's something we don't get a lot with teenage movies now, especially ones made by Disney and actually made to target that demographic. Now I turn over to you guys. What do you think about Adventures in Babysitting? Have you seen it? Have you only seen the Disney edited version? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments. If you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. As always, I'm Colby. This is my nerdy talk, and I'll see you in the next video.